Moving beyond your parents' divorce. Forward. Our culture informs us that parents who divorce will inevitably stigmatize their children, and they will then have a more difficult time in their long-term emotional and social adjustment. If we believe this myth, we must also support the corollary that children of intact marriages, no matter what the quality of that relationship, will have an easier time in their subsequent emotional and social development, including their own marriages. In Moving Beyond Your Parents' Divorce, the Kranzlers successfully challenged this myth by presenting overwhelming evidence that being a child of divorce, moi, in itself, is not the stigmatizing, destructive influence some hold it to be. The belief that divorce will have a destructive impact on children has gained the status of myth in our society. As such, it is generally unquestioned and is transmitted from one generation to the next. The Kranzlers have been working with divorced and divorcing individuals for 3 decades. In recent years, they have focused their energies and research on children of divorce. In this book, they argue that the persistent cultural myth about the long-term destructiveness of divorce on children no longer has a basis in fact. They challenge the myth and present a convincing case for us to take a new, benevolent, objective look at children of divorce. Myth. Myth is a form of social behavior. It does not arise without reason. There is always some basis for the origins of myth, and there is usually some basis for the energy that sustains myth across time. The myth that children of divorce would incur difficulties as a result of the divorce may have been multi-determined. It may have served as an indirect threat against divorcing. It may have reflected a fear that the tendency to divorce may be transmitted from parent to child. It most probably reflected the obvious fact that children of divorce would lack part of the important parenting that the children of intact unions would receive. In an era when divorce was the exception, children of divorce stood out in any community. Any difficulty in the development or behavior of a child of divorce could easily be assigned to the fact that this was a child of divorce. Those children of divorce who turned out well could be explained away as the exception that proves the rule. The myth did not take into account the possibility that some children of divorce could actually do better in their development once free of the stress of a deteriorating and possibly violent marital environment. The myth may have served to sustain marriages by implying a threat to their offspring if the person separated or divorced. It may have reflected the vulnerability of married women in the days before community property laws. It may have been a means of enhancing marital stability, to conform to religious pronouncements about the nature of marriage and the responsibility of parenting. Divorce was taken as a sign that something was fundamentally wrong with the people involved. Sadly, this negative attitude was carried over to the children of divorce. They were stigmatized. It was widely believed that they could not possibly turn out well as the children of intact marriages. Demythologizing children of divorce. Times have changed. Divorce, once the exception, now impact almost half of all marriages. Children of divorce, once exceptions in the community, are now common. Family structure has also changed. Single parents and working mothers are now accepted without the stigmatization they would have experienced during the previous century. But what about the children of divorce? Is it still fair to stigmatize them, to have negative expectations for their future development and happiness? The Kranzlers ask us to dismiss the myth that divorce always has an adverse impact on the emotional and social development of children. They argue their case from their extensive work with families of divorce over the last 3 decades. They present evidence that some children have developed insights and interpersonal skills simply because of the impact of parental divorce. They suggest that children have an innate resiliency that enables them to not only endure but also actually surmount the challenges presented by parental divorce. The Kranzler's case is also strengthened by several factors. There is no convincing evidence to support the cultural myth that divorce has a negative impact on the involved children, or that children of divorce are not as well adjusted as children of intact marriages. In fact, for some children, the divorce can result in a lessening of stress and a freedom from the discord, tensions, and even violence that predated the actual separation or divorce. Children of divorce can become model, happy, productive citizens, while children of intact marriages can become outrageous criminals. The successful children of divorce are not simply the exception that proves the rule, any more than the delinquent children of intact marriages are proof that marriage in itself has a toxic influence on child development. Having a divorce in one's background is not the ultimate determining factor in adolescent or adult behavior. This is not meant to minimize the stress of discord and divorce on children, but as the Kranzlers repeatedly point out, the negative myth about the impact of divorce does not take into account the natural resiliency of many children. During my training in child psychiatry, I heard the dictum that children tend to turn out either good or bad to a large extent depending on their parents' fantasies about them. In general, children respond to benevolent expectations just as they are subject to the influence of repeated, hurtful expectations uttered by parents and other significant persons. We have also been told that no matter how much a child has been abused, they can survive and surmount hardship and stress if, during their formative years, at least one adult proves to be a constant, psychologically nurturing influence for them. The influence of genetics. One of the most interesting developments in recent years has been the relationship of genetic science to behavior. Odd as it may seem, genetics has some relevance to the subject of this book. We know that divorce is generally a stressful event or series of events in a family. We also know from the extensive work of the Kranzlers that divorce does not produce consistently adverse effects on all persons involved, including children. What other factors must be taken into account in determining the development and the later behavior of children of divorce? We cannot exclude the possibility that genetic factors play a role in the development of children, whether or not they are exposed to the stress of divorce. In fact, genetic factors may play a role in what is referred to in this book as resiliency. Are some children more resilient than others? To be more specific, are some children more likely to surmount adverse circumstances than others, to remain apparently unaffected by adversity while others are less able to surmount adverse circumstances? A 30-year longitudinal study of 442 white male New Zealanders, starting from the time of birth, was reported in August 2002 by Caspi and colleagues in the journal Science. These authors offer strong evidence for a genetic determinant of behavior, at least in white males who had been neglected and abused during childhood. The study provides evidence for why some children are resilient while others are adversely impacted by neglect and abuse, as evident in their subsequent behavior. The determining factor is a gene located on the X male chromosome that produces an enzyme, monoamine oxidase A, MAOA. The enzyme MAOA degrades naturally occurring neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. There are two varieties of the gene on the X chromosome, one that results in high levels of MAOA and the other in low amounts. Earlier studies in mice showed low MAOA to be linked to aggressive behavior, as did one study in human subjects. In the journal Nature in 2002, Gross and his research team demonstrated the action of the serotonin receptor, 1-A, in the development of anxiety-like behavior in the adult. Other studies, including Belzung's, printed in Behavioral Pharmacology in 2001, demonstrate the relationship between genetics and the pharmacological effect of anxiolytics. 55 subjects in the study had low levels of MAOA. This group with low MAOA was twice as likely as their high-level MAOA to have engaged in persistent fighting, bullying, theft, cruelty, and vandalism during adolescence. The low MAOA group were also more likely to have been convicted of a crime than their high-level MAOA counterparts who had also been abused or neglected. Low MAOA in the absence of abuse does not in itself increase the risk of later delinquency or criminal behavior. Thus, there is no genetic determination that can be traced to levels of MAOA. The predisposition to later disturbed behavior is multi-determined. As contributing author Terry Moffat from King's College London, England states, genes can moderate children's sensitivity to environmental insults. Another researcher from King's College, Ian Craig, said, maltreatment seems to cause lasting changes in brain chemistry. He also suggests that genetic variation in levels of MAOA may partly explain why not all victims of maltreatment grow up to victimize others. Some genotypes, those that lead to high levels of MAOA, may promote resistance to trauma. In a recent 2002 review in New England Journal of Medicine of the long-term effects of early genetic influences on behavior, Dr. Friedman stated that the research presently does not answer the question of whether the effect of an experience on the mouse or genetically controlled development determines in adult behavior. He further states, a full answer might reveal interesting interactions, such as a possible interaction between adverse experience and genetically determined biologic mechanisms that alter neuronal development. Indeed, the introduction of genetic techniques into behavioral science makes research into such questions more feasible than it has previously been.